Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited for having all of you, and especially Kat and Uzma in this meeting. So the purpose of the meeting is some general understanding of the IRBs and why we do need an IRB for our research and how is the process. And then you can all ask your questions from to a specialist here because some people are we were feeling that some people are intimidated with the name of the IRB, so it's better to give them a general standard, a general understanding. And let's start by introducing myself. I'm Roche Ashrafi, and I'm in my fourth year of infrastructures and environmental systems program, um, and I'm a graduate life fellow. And this is Dylan. Dylan, do you also want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Dylan Turner. Like Roche, I'm also a Graduate Life Fellow here in the Center for Graduate Life. And I am in my second year of the Master's in Ethics and Applied Philosophy program, and will be entering into the Geography PhD program here at Charlotte in the fall. So coming from philosophy, IRBs, and research that requires IRBs is pretty new to me, and was pretty excited to have this event and to learn a little bit more about them myself. And so with that, if we could turn it over to Kat and Uzma and let you both introduce yourselves.
I can, oh, go ahead, Kat.
Oh, no, go ahead. All right.
Okay, I can start, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt Kat. Hi everyone, my name is Uzma. I am the IRB Analyst in the Office of Research Protections and Integrity. And in this position, I provide regulatory guidance, compliance guidance to faculty, staff, and researchers who are involved with human subject research. Also guidance on federal and state and local regulations. I also do some of the administrative reviews and provide feedback for the researchers for the applications. Thank you.
Thanks. And I'm Kat. I'm the IRB Manager. So I kind of oversee kind of from maybe a little bit of a higher level in terms of the program itself. So the Human Subjects Protection Program for the university as a whole, and kind of the components of that program in terms of having an IRB, an institutional review board, which we'll talk about, maintaining the appropriate compliance assurances with the federal government for that IRB. I support the IRB committee itself. So those individuals who review all the research protocols, their faculty. So I support their work, as does Uzma, and as we look at the IRB applications that come into the office. So I do a lot of the protocol reviews as well, but sometimes it's some of the additional stuff I do is just more at the program level and kind of developing guidance or facilitating kind of larger questions about policy or interpretation of regulations and so forth. But for the most part, Uzma and I do, in terms of the IRB protocol review and anything with our online application system and talking to researchers, you are welcome to speak with either of us about any of those topics. And if there's something that we will want to consult with each other, we can certainly do that. But in any case, so that's a brief introduction on us. Sorry.
Awesome, thanks and welcome. So we'll go ahead and get started then. This is going to be sort of the overview, the layout of what the meeting is going to entail today. And Roche, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dylan. So first of all, we want to ask both Kat and Uzma that what are institutional review boards? And especially if you can give us a basic of understanding that what is IRBs. For now, for me, it was somehow the feeling of it's an institution that protects people, protects human subjects. If you can have your basic explanation of what is IRBs. Thank you.
Sure, sure. So an IRB is an institutional review board. That's what the acronym stands for. And any institution or organization that receives federal monies, so funding from the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, really any federal money that if an institution will receive that federal money and it involves doing research that will involve human subjects, we are required to have an institutional review board. And that is a group of individuals. In the case of academic institutions, it's primarily faculty, although it can also be staff members. And it does also include community members, but essentially think of an IRB as just a group of researchers and non-researchers who come together to review research that involves human subjects, and their sole purpose is to protect the rights and welfare of those people who will be in that research study. So, I mean, the regulations go into specific details of what the IRB committee must look at when they're reviewing research, but really the kind of the single kind of nugget of information to know is that their purpose is to protect the rights and welfare of those human subjects. So again, we are required to have an institutional review board because we as in UNC Charlotte accept federal funding. So we have this institutional review board. Again, it's made up of faculty. The UNC Charlotte IRB, I believe, has 14 individuals on it now. We've had a little bit of shifting in the people on the committee recently, but it's mostly made up of faculty, and they are researchers themselves, many of them, in fact, most of them. We have community members because the regulations do require that the IRB has some individuals who are not affiliated at all with the university, and that is intended to bring in some additional perspectives, so people who won't have the same interest as the university might have, so kind of to eliminate some bias potentially, as well as the IRB needs to have people on the committee who are non-scientists, so people who can really represent or think about the perspective of the actual participants, the people who would be in the research study, so the human subjects. So sometimes you can get really deep into the science, and our non-scientists are really intended to think, well, what would it be like to actually be in this research study? And what would I want to know from as a human subject? So that's really what the IRB is. They're brought to their group that is to review all research protocols that involve human subjects. And they have specific regulatory criteria that they have to look at. And Uzma and I facilitate that process when researchers actually submit IRB applications. So this, Rosh, you have the slide that the regulations do require that any project that meets the research definition and will also involve human subjects requires IRB approval. So I think it's important to understand that when we're talking, so Uzma and I, when we're talking about human subjects and research, we're always thinking about these particular definitions, because for sure, you can have different disciplines. I mean, even thinking about philosophy, I mean, how different disciplines define research is very different across the board. I mean, there's work that historians do that's research, but that research that they do as historians might not actually meet the regulatory definition for research or what research is. Mm-hmm. The human subjects definition is a little bit easier. I mean, kind of simply put, it really is, if you're gonna have people in your research study and have them do things, get information about them, have an interaction with them, they're going to be a human subject. And I do think that, actually, I feel like I'm kind of talking. Maybe I'll pause and see if anybody has questions about what I've said so far. Sorry.
It was great explanation. Thank you so much, Kay.
Sure.
Yeah, and I included that slide you talked about. We are going to go to it. Thank you.
So yeah, y'all touched on this a little bit already, but the why you need one seems incredibly important. So dealing with research with human subjects, and of course you said you're working with a particular understanding of what research is. So maybe it'd be better if we moved on to this next one. Whoop. Yeah, so maybe a little bit more on the specifics of what is research per, the regulations that you all follow. And I know you said the human subjects one is a little bit easier to define.
Sure. Excuse me. So the research definition is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So it's really this idea that, the way that I kind of sort of piece out that definition. So thinking about, it's a systematic investigation. So typically there's kind of a standard methodology, you have standardized procedures, you want to collect information in a systematic way because you need to be able to get results to answer a hypothesis, to test an idea, whatever the research question might be. So you might have a hypothesis and you need to have sort of a defined way to answer that question or to test the hypothesis. So that's what I think about in thinking about a systematic investigation. And it really is methodical, very step-by-step. I've got to do this first and then this and so on down the road to get to that kind of end result. So systematic investigation, and it's designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So that really means that the purpose of the project is to get an answer to that research question or test that hypothesis and then take those findings or those outcomes and generalize them, make them broadly applicable. So it's maybe the findings are applicable to all college students, even if though you used 10 people in your study or something. So it is to contribute in that way, in a broader impact way. That could be, there's a lot of research that we have from even just undergraduate honors students, and that work may not ultimately be having a significantly broad impact, but it might be contributing even just to the literature, like adding to the body of work. Research projects often are maybe, in addition to testing new ideas or hypotheses, but it could also be refining current knowledge that's out in the field that you're studying. And maybe the project that you are thinking about doing will refine some current understanding in the field, or maybe refute even some of that understanding. So I think kind of an easy way to think about research. And I say this a little bit with hesitation because Uzma and I don't want researchers to just default to this, but it is common to kind of think, if you need sort of just that one easy little trigger, is that if you are going to present or publish your findings, that oftentimes that publication and presentation means that you're intending to generalize your knowledge. So again, there's a lot of kind of caveats in there where it may not be the case, but for this group and the type of work that you guys will be doing, that's a really good kind of rule of thumb to use, that if you want to present at the Graduate Student Research Symposium, or you want to potentially publish from a thesis or dissertation, then the research definition, most likely like 99% of the time, is going to be met. Great. So that's what I think about research.
Thank you so much for that answer. Yeah, and I guess then on the human subject side, is there anything else to add to that, or it seems pretty straightforward?
I feel like the human subjects definition is more straightforward. I think it can get a little complicated for researchers in fields like data science, or even sometimes in bioinformatics, because the data that might be used, maybe it's just a data set, big data kind of set, or data from an organization or company, so administrative data, or maybe it's I don't know, population health survey data. It could be really any kind of data set. That data is about people, even if the researcher, him or herself, is not actually actively collecting that data on their own. They might be using an existing data set, or maybe Yeah, using administrative data. So that would be the one of the parts of the human subject definition that I would say it's always really good to ask the question. So if you are not going to have any direct interaction with a person, but you're still going to use data about people, we would still want to talk to you about whether or not the human subject's definition is met. It may not be if the data you're getting is non-identifiable, so that you as the researcher would have no way to ascertain someone's identity from that data set. But there are circumstances where the data might not be non-identifiable. So certainly we have a lot of researchers, faculty researchers, who are doing research with their own students and their own courses. And all of that data is identifiable, even if they're getting it after the fact. So a couple of years later, after a course is done, for example. So I think that would be the one component of that definition I would just say to think about or ask the question about, at least as you're starting to do your research, because the human subject definition, when you're interacting with people, engaging with them directly, talking to them, doing online survey research or even interview, like that stuff seems more obvious because I'm actually talking to someone. I'm having that communication in some way, even if it's indirectly with an online survey. I think can sometimes be more complicated when it's just data only and I'm actually not talking to anybody directly. And then it's good to at least ask the question of our office.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much for that answer.
Sure.
So, Roche, I'll pass this over to you.
Thank you. Awesome. Just before we get to this slide, can we go to the slide, the second slide, Dylan? I
Sure.
also want to ask another question, another follow-up question. Yeah, this one. This is my favorite because sometimes we are getting like this feeling that maybe because we don't have to publish or we don't want to publish the results for now. So maybe we better skip the IRB process to start the research sooner because we're always in a hurry. So can you please explain a little more on why do we need the IRB and yeah, basically why do we need the IRB? And if, for example, I want to, this was my particular question. If I'm doing a research in a class and I'm not intended to publish the results or the research results for now, and I think that maybe I want to do it in some months later or some years later. What is the process for that? If I change my mind for publishing the results, can I get back for having an IRB, or do I need to do it now? Why do I need one now?
So that's a great question. I think, so really it's going to come down to intent and what you intend at the time that you're developing the project. So if you're conducting a class project and it's only for the class, you're going to write the paper for the course instructor, present maybe your findings to the class in a presentation, but that's really the end of it. And you don't have, at that point, you have no intention of wanting to do anything further with it. And I think that's sort of that component for you as researchers and students to kind of be mindful of that and think about what your real intent and purpose is. So it's one thing if you are just doing that project, I've got to get this done this semester. That's really all I intend to do. And I mean, I think as well, and I'm kind of making an assumption here, but I think with some class projects that have to be implemented over the course of the semester, like oftentimes it's a small nugget of an idea. And it can be that you do that project, you turn it in, and only years down the road, you're sort of reflecting on that and what you've learned. And wow, that was really interesting. Can I use that for research purposes? That's one thing. It's very different, I would say, if you're at the start of that class and you're thinking, I think this could be really interesting, but I don't have time for IRB approval. Like that's more not really an IRB question. That's more of kind of a responsible conduct of research question, because IRB approval cannot be retroactive. So if you are doing an activity that is not research, it's never intended to be research, you don't have the intention at the time you're conducting the project that it would ever be research. It is for a class project, it's for a program evaluation, for a service or something that, and we have this a lot with program evaluation, or a quality improvement project. So it's not research. It's not going to meet that definition by any means, because you don't intend for it to be generalizable. You're using it only for the class or only for your institution in terms of that program evaluation, or only for whatever the purpose may be. Then if it does happen somewhere down the road that you've done a class project and now you're thinking about your dissertation, and maybe that class project would be informative, then part of it, I mean, the key is that you now have an intention of using what was non-research data. So I think that's really the key, is that class project was never intended to be used for research purposes. And you should be really confident about that at the time you're making that decision. If it was never intended to be used for research purposes, and now 3 years down the road, I think I might find some research value in it, then your IRB application may become asking or requesting approval to use data that was previously collected for non-research purposes, and now I want to use it for research purposes. So, but I think that the kind of sensitivity that is needed when you're making that decision is that it can't be about that I don't have time for IRB. It has to be that this is not a research project and I never intend for it to be a research project. And then later, if it's because some other work you've done might show that there might be some value to that non-research data. But if you're doing a class project and you're thinking, yeah, this might be really good for my thesis or my dissertation, but I don't really have time for IRB, then, I mean, you can't use that data. You would have to essentially kind of start over at the point, because you knew at the time, really your intention at the time was that maybe I would use this for research in the future. And really the question is, will you or won't you? If you think you might, and there might be value, then you need to get IRB. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but it really comes down to intent and what the purpose of the project is. If it is for research, in addition to a class project, then you need IRB. If it is never intended for research purposes, then you don't need IRB. Although again, as I said, if it's years down the road and you can make the proposal to the IRB that all of this data was collected for non-research purposes, but now I want to use it for research. And that does happen. I mean, it does happen. I would say it more commonly happens with, not so much with class projects, but really with faculty who are doing kind of self-evaluation of their curriculums that maybe, I mean, obviously the kind of stuff they're testing out or trying with students to improve pedagogy is very different than research. But after trying something for pedagogy for maybe 3 semesters, they suddenly think, wow, I'm seeing some real improvement here in student outcomes. So I now actually want to use this for research. So what it then becomes is all of this educational curriculum, pedagogy work will become a research project. And they would still have to address the same kind of ethical considerations, including potentially informed consent from all of those students who were in their classes in the past. And sorry, I keep going on and on and on.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kat. It was great information. I was always wondering that we have a section in the IRB forum for already existing data or past data. I was wondering what it is for then. Now I got my answer. Thank you so much. Yeah. So Dylan, do you want to go to the next slide or?
Sure. So we were wanting to know from y'all's perspective, what are you looking for in these applications when you're reviewing them, and what questions do researchers need to consider before submitting an application? So I know there was that one rule of thumb you mentioned, if I'm going to present it or publish it or contribute it to generalized knowledge, then, that's something to keep in mind. But, perhaps maybe some nuts and bolts on things to be thinking about as a researcher puts these applications together.
Sure, I can go ahead and answer that. So when an application comes to us with the IRB, and I think this answers kind of both the questions of what an IRB is looking at and what a researcher should think about when they're submitting an application. Most important thing, like study design and what method you're going to use to conduct the study. What is your target population? What kind of recruitment are you going to use? And I'm going to go a little bit and each one of them, but I'm just kind of listing the most important things off first. Then also the risk and benefit assessment for the study. Also informed consent process, and importantly, protecting the privacy and maintaining confidentiality of the participants in the study. So when a study comes to us, we want to make sure you look at the study design and you see, is there a process, like what are you going to do first? You explain to us clearly like what your goal is and how the study design is going to let you get that goal and attain that result. And then what kind of population are you using to get your study participants? Also, you want to make sure you're not accessing this study population just because you have easy access to them, because sometimes we see a lot of UNC students or staff, but you want to make sure that your study goal is to get data, and that will help you to get this. So you don't want to just because they're easy to get to, and also we want to make sure there's no undue influence when it comes to students. So you don't want to make sure they if there's a consent form, it doesn't say, it says on there, you don't have to, it's voluntary to take part in this study and you don't have to. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but so you want to make sure as a recruitment, you're not telling them you have to take part, this is part of the study, your class, but you want to say it's voluntary, you can decide to take part and it's not, or decide not to. Most importantly, you're giving them all the information that a participant needs to make the decision on their own. And also if they're using populations that cannot make the decision on their own, some studies include children or people who are ill or mentally disabled. So you want to make sure there's additional protections. That's what the IRB looks for, additional protections to make sure they're not taking advantage of a population that's susceptible to that vulnerable population. And then risk and benefits. Obviously, new studies are there to discover new things, new and effective ways, hopefully. So when we are judging the risk and benefits, you want to make sure that the participants are not exposed to undue risks that they have to take, and their benefits balance the risk that they're being exposed to. And you're explaining how you're doing that to us, that the risk you're exposing them to is the benefit's going to be greater than the risk that you're providing. And the IRB application has I think every section is explained to see social risk, emotional risk, privacy, how you're going to protect all this for the participants. So IRB kind of goes through that, and Kat and I do, just to make sure you're explaining how the study design is going to help the participants and protect them. Recruitment, I think I went through that, informed consent process. So we do have templates on our website and kind of help the researchers to kind of look at these examples and see what is included, and we kind of let them know. Important section, just list out important things like what is the purpose of the study, how much time it's going to take, is it anonymous, is your data going to be used in a future study or not, are you getting any incentives or not. So important things. And then late in the application, it seems like you might be repeating some of this information, but it does help the participants understand it better too, and also using layman terms when you're explaining these things, so people kind of off the street can understand it, and they don't have to be kind of scholars or anything to read this application and understand what's happening in the study. So keep it simple with the language, and that's what we see in the informed consent. And sometimes if protocol is a little complicated, I will go to the informed consent and see, because sometimes I read through that and I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot more sense, because it's kind of more for the participants to explain the procedures, and it's a little simpler to understand for the participants, and protecting the privacy and maintaining confidentiality. So there might be a lot of kind of sensitive topics, and also recruitment too. I think depends on where you're recruiting, from a clinic, or where is this recruitment being posted. So you want to make sure it's the patient's privacy, they protect the privacy of the participants, and you're not being exposed to undue exposure from oh, which study are you taking part in? Or are you taking part in this study? It's not So I think those are the things we look at. And as a researcher, I think those are the important things to think about in a study design, is make sure your study design is, the methodology is there. So you're explaining all of these things, minimizing risk, maximizing benefits, how are you going to recruit, and explain the consent process, and make sure it's very comprehensive in the consent process so that everyone can understand what's going on. I'll look at anything else.
Great, thank you for that.
Of course. I'm trying to think of like anything else. I was like, no, I think I touched most of them, but yeah.
No, definitely, it's a lot, and I think it helps definitely from our perspective, you know, understanding how it's going to be reviewed. And I think sometimes, like any of us, we can have blind spots and say, okay, this is, you know, the question I'm going to answer, and this is how I'm going to answer it. And then maybe there is some questionable activity or something in the method that's a little bit, you know, ethically off. And so understanding, you know, what y'all are looking at, what rubric you're kind of grading by, is helpful.
I think it's also important because you, as a researcher, you guys know so much in depth about your study and where you're going from it, that you would think that you read the application and it seems it all makes sense to you. But since I don't have that in-depth knowledge about your project and where you're going, and with that information, it's hard. I think as an IRB, if you don't have the right context, it's hard to understand some of the things that might seem very simple to a researcher who's submitting the study. You're like, why do I have to explain this? Because they're like, we're recruiting students, and you're like, explain to me why, you know, there would be a good part of population or whatever. And then, but to you, because you're so, you know so much about your study and so in depth that you're like, this makes perfect sense to me to have a student, you know, from a sophomore year or whatever. But to us, I think that just the explanation needs to be included with things just to make it super clear. So IRB can, and also it helps through the review process. So we're not kind of sending it back to you. And so review time kind of also helps, because then we review it, we have no questions, everything's kind of clear to us and kind of moves on from there, and we can process your application. So it definitely helps with that also. And I think I want to say we are always there. Like Kat and I are always there to answer any questions. If you're stuck on anything or have any questions on something, or something in the application is not clear to understand, because the wording sometimes also depends on the perspective. For us, we look at a different perspective, and as researchers, you guys look at a question in a different way. So might not make sense sometimes, or you look at it differently, like I said, and answer differently, and we're looking for a different answer, or we don't understand it the same way. So always feel free to reach out to us. We're not here to kind of be like, you didn't do this or you didn't do that. We're here to kind of help you. We're here for the participants' protection. We're here for researchers to make sure you get your goals. And I mean, the fastest, not the fastest, but like the safest and the quicker way to get there for your project. So we're always here to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Interesting part. So what are the mistakes that we mostly do? I personally started so late. I was expecting my IRB process to like have 1 week of waiting time.
I think that was one of the most important things I was going to say. The first thing is like, I think the timing is mostly because people are like, I have to start this tomorrow, not tomorrow. I mean, like next week I have to, you know, so, and I think most thing is the time. If you're thinking about it, you should get started in the process and reach out to us, because there's definitely, it takes about 4 to 7 weeks to kind of process, depending on what level of review also is an application. And like I said, depends on if we understand it the same way we do and you don't have any questions, everything is explained clearly, perfect language, everything is great. You have all the survey material that you need, all the questionnaires. There's nothing that you're asking in there that we feel like is, is this needed in this project or not? You know, just everything is perfect, then yes, it will probably go quicker. But the moment somebody thinks about a study, I think they should kind of start off the project, because the review process does take. And I think that's one of the most common mistakes applicants make is they expect the review to, they submitted 3 days ago, or they submit on a Friday, and you're like, oh, Monday, is it back? Or is it done yet? And you're like, no, it's not, it probably won't be done over the weekend. So I think that's one of the, time is one of the things that researchers need to think about.
And I'll just add, if I can, that this is a good time for me to remind folks that the IRB committee, so the people who will review the protocols, and not all of them, there are some protocols that don't have to go to the IRB, but some do anyway. But the point is a lot of protocols do. I mean, I'd say we're probably 50-50% in terms of studies that have to go to an IRB committee member. And it may not have to go to the committee at a monthly meeting, but it goes to an individual member of the committee for review. And IRB members, as I said, they're faculty and they're doing all of this work as really a volunteer service that they do to the university. And absolutely their teaching and other responsibilities unfortunately take precedence because there's no, I mean, they don't get compensated, there's no time release, it's just doing it amongst everything else. So oftentimes, and not always, because Uzma and I can attest to the fact that just if we've got 20 protocols in the queue, I mean, it just takes a while to get through all of them. But if your protocol has been submitted out for an IRB member review, we usually give reviewers 7 to 10 days to complete that. So already I would sort of think about your timeline as at least minimally building that in, and then thinking about, you know, how long it might take you to recruit and informed consent. And you just have to start backing up your timeline from there. Yeah, I would agree with Uzma. The timeline thing is probably the biggest thing.
I would say like one more thing is recruitment, like when you mentioned about thinking in the timeline, because some researchers, maybe they're doing a study because they have access to a population. They're like, oh, this is a great study to do. Like, why haven't you thought about this? And so they have access to this population that they know. And recruitment is obviously part of the study. So they'll submit the study and then I will get questions. If it's taking a little longer because there's certain clarifications that need to be made or things like that, people just assume that they can maybe talk to those people and tell them about their study. But that is part of the recruitment, is part of the study, and nothing can be done. Like, you cannot do any recruitment, anything before the study is approved by the IRB. And I think that's important to know, because people do think, oh, I do know this person, or, know a couple of people. And that is not recruitment really. I'm just talking to them about, and that is part of the recruitment. And so it's important to know that you cannot do any part of the study, any part, even including recruitment, until the study is approved by the IRB and you get a letter saying, go ahead, you can start with the study procedures now. So.
Thank
I was
you
wanting,
so much.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Roche.
Go ahead, Dylan.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up to what y'all said before. You said that sometimes, or the protocol, the application will be in different levels of review. I was wondering maybe like a quick overview of like what those different levels are.
Sure. So there are 3.1 types of, or levels of review. So really there's exempt, expedited, and full board. And those categories go up the spectrum of risk. So exempt studies are expected by their very nature to be no risk or very, very low risk. Like maybe the only risk is an informational risk. So not wanting to have a release of study data or something, or maintain privacy and confidentiality. So exemption, no risk, very low risk. There's very specific categories of exemption for maybe just survey research, interviews, some educational research. So stuff that's happening in kind of the normal classroom setting might be exempt. Some studies that involve data only. So for secondary data analyses might be exempt, but these are really low risk studies. The review process for those studies is really an administrative review, because the exemption means that they are categories that the regulations have defined as not needing the full scope of the regulations in terms of the approval criteria. So it is a little bit of sometimes a shorter application. I would sort of tell people today that, 5 years ago, exemption may have been a much quicker process, but now it's actually not so much, because there's so much really volume that goes through that process. So that's the first one. I said 3.1. So there is another category of exemption that's called exemption with limited review. And this is something the feds put into place in 2018. And so I don't call it its own category necessarily, because it still is an exemption, but these are studies that are still low risk, but maybe there is something a bit more sensitive about the subject matter. Maybe the data will be identifiable and it needs to be because you as researchers need it to be. And that's something really, actually, I need to mentally remember to highlight that point. Exemptions with limited review, that limited review component means that that protocol does have to go to an IRB member for review of the privacy and confidentiality standards that the researcher is proposing. So that's why it's limited, because it's not subject to the full scope of the regulations and all of that criteria for approval. It's only subject to that one little piece as relates to privacy and confidentiality. But still, it's technically an exemption. So still, the foundation is that it has to be low risk. Expedited review is a mid-level category review. It's horribly named because it does not mean fast. It just means faster than the full board review, which is what the highest level of category is. So expedited is the type of review that's applicable to studies that might do video recording and focus groups. There might be some sort of manipulation. And it doesn't have to be invasive procedures, but it could be that you're trying to assign, the study is assigning people to different groups to see how they respond differently to different kind of scenarios, whatever it may be. But there typically is an intervention maybe, but there's something about that's maybe the subject matter or the procedures that make it just really not eligible for exemption, essentially. And those applications go out to one member of the committee. And so at least one member, I should say. And those usually take a little bit longer for that very reason, because they're faculty and we give them 7 to 10 days to do that review. The highest level of review is the full board review. And those are the studies that are higher risk, so greater than minimal risk, so greater risk than you would experience in normal everyday life. These are often invasive procedures, maybe very sensitive subject matter, so maybe asking people about illegal behaviors, or using vulnerable populations. So for example, we have a lot of studies that have used Alzheimer's patients, and those would go to the full board because it is a very vulnerable population. And those protocols are reviewed at monthly meetings of the committee, and the committee just meets at this point only September through June. So there is some important planning needed if researchers might be doing a research study that would involve or would require full board review. So those are the review categories. Again, they go up in the spectrum of risk. I would say again, or as well in terms of timeline, they probably go up the spectrum of taking less time to more time, although I do think kind of really exempt and expedited at this point are almost taking the same amount of time, just because primarily for volume purposes when it comes to exempt. But the one little tidbit, if I can just focus on now, because I think this is probably something, I don't want to say a common mistake, but I think it's maybe a misconception. So I think it can be common that researchers think that everything has to be anonymous, that I can't ask people identifying information, or I can't collect emails, or the IRB does not say you can't do that. I mean, you need to, as a researcher, you need to design a study that is appropriate to answer your research questions, that collects the data you need to be able to answer those research questions. And if that includes, I'm going to collect email addresses and names of people because I need to follow up with them, or maybe there's an incentive I'm being offered. I mean, the fact is you have to get that information. The IRB is not going to not approve a study because you need to collect identifiers. What it become, I mean, if you can actually do your study with a completely anonymous survey, for example, great. But if you need identifiers, please get them. And what becomes, I mean, yes, the application may change slightly. Maybe it's not going to fit into one of the exemption categories, but you can still do that research. It would just be a different review category. And the IRB would be looking to understand how you will manage those identifiers, how long you will keep them. I mean, ideally, you're only keeping them as long as you absolutely need to. Typically, that kind of stuff can be destroyed after data analyses. So I think the misconception is that everything has to be anonymous, and that's absolutely not the case. It should really be about what you need to collect to answer your research questions. And again, it may require a different type of IRB review, but it's still doable. It still can get to approval.
Thank you so much, Kat. It was all lots of great points here that I thought that because I did the process 2 times, I know a lot about IRB, but I've just learned that I don't. Uh, so thank you. So we were going to talk a little more about the CITI application and starting early and COVID regulation, but I also want to ask the audience if they have any questions. Feel free to um, put their questions in the chat or unmute themselves, ask the question, because I think we are running low on time. And if there was no questions for now, we can start on talking about the COVID regulation, if you think it's a good subject. So maybe we can talk about the COVID, and in the meantime, sure, Amir, please.
Okay, thank you for your informative presentations. I got a very valuable information. I have a questions regarding the those kind of research that are conducting in the labs. For example, I want to conduct a research with among my lab mates, also those people who are affiliated with the labs. As far as I know, and according to your explanation, I think when I got those informations, I can then apply for the IRB. I just want to, I would be appreciated if you just clarify first, do I need to apply IRB before conduct that kind of research just among those people in my labs, or I can do my research and then after, then apply for the IRB? Thank you.
I think I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but I think if your lab is going to do research that involves people, and then you would need IRB approval before you do that work. So I think it depends on what the work is. I mean, if it's bench work that's not involving people, then you wouldn't need IRB at all. So maybe talk about what.
Yeah, I think Amir's point was that what if the subjects of the research are themselves researchers at the same lab?
Oh, I mean, that's going to also depend on what you're doing, because I mean, I think if you're testing something, maybe a device or a technique or a strategy, if you're testing it on yourself to generate information that would contribute to generalizable knowledge, and again, it's about you and everybody in your lab, then it might be human subjects. I think it really depends on the specifics of what it is. I mean, we've had some researchers who, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of an example. Yeah, and I'm totally blanking, I'm sorry. I think it depends on what you're testing. I mean, it's really one thing if it's sort of, no, I'm trying to think of a good example of something. Maybe you would.
I was trying to think of something that could not be research if you're testing it on other people, but that would just mean it's research. As long as there are people involved, yeah.
Maybe more specifics, maybe.
Yeah. Mary, do you have any like specific thing that you might not give out your idea, but like something kind of point us in a direction if you're not answering the question?
In our case, we are just in testing a device, and we are inviting people to work with the device and get the feedbacks. It's a kind of device that works with the virtual reality, so human involved, basically.
I mean, I definitely feel like you're probably going to be close at the point where you should get approval, because it's one thing if you were constructing the device to see if it even works and you're testing, and I'm just making stuff up here.
Yeah.
Testing that the electrical current works, that you turn it on and all the interfaces work, that that actually sort of does what you've programmed it to do. I mean, that's one thing if you're kind of playing around with it, testing it out, making sure that, you know, the next button, again, making stuff up here, works. That's one thing. But once you've got the device ready and you want to actually test it and see if it's if it does exactly what you said it is going to do in terms of whatever that interaction with the person might be, whether it's, and this would be really the case, whether it's in even like a software app, or yeah, some type of a device, even if people don't necessarily have to wear it, but maybe they're, I think the only thing I could think of that maybe wouldn't be research would be if, I don't know, like if the device is and I'm again making stuff up here, if it's a beacon or something and you need to have someone walk in the room and see if it connects with their cell phone just to see if it works. Like that type of stuff is, to me, not at the research point, but if you've got that device developed and you're ready to really put it to the test, so to speak, with people, then that type of user study, I would say, is something that you would want to get IRB for. And I mean, I don't know that we would really make the distinction between I mean, I guess it's one thing if it's just you, but I think at the point that you want to include anybody else and start to actually take those findings more than just like, I'm putting my stuff in the device or seeing if it measures my temperature, again, making stuff up here. Yeah, then I would say you would probably want to pause and seek approval.
Thank you.
Sure. Did I get everything you think, Uzma, or do you want to add anything?
Yeah,
No, I think you're right. Yes. So like, I think that kind of helps to say if you're building it and you're testing it to make sure it works, then that's different, but you already have something and you're just trying to test on different people to see if it's actually working, or you just test on yourself and you're like, I think I got the results, but then you want to try it on someone else to see if it's giving the same result or something else, then yes, I would probably just submit to the IRB and just be safe. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Amir, if your question is resolved.
Yes, thank you. I got my answer.
Do anyone else have any questions who want to ask, or if you want, you can put it in the chat. Can we talk a little about the COVID regulation, Kat or Uzma? Do you want to add some points about that one? And in the meantime, we see if people have any questions, and they can put them in the chat and we can ask.
Sure. So really, I mean, the thing about COVID requirements really falls back to what the university standard is. So what I mean is the IRB is not saying yes or no, you can do research strictly based on, and I'm assuming we're talking about COVID in terms of implementing your research, not that you're studying COVID. But in terms of implementing your research, the IRB, that's not something that they necessarily consider, because it's, in a manner, it's not entirely their purview. What they defer to is what the university standard is. So, and what I mean is, so the university is operational, labs are doing their work. I think there has been a time when, or not, I think there definitely was a time when we were in more lockdown, where labs had to get permission at the university level. So it wasn't IRB permission, it was at the university level in terms of being able to open their labs, have people on campus. Now it's definitely a little bit, I would say, sort of looser in terms of that, because the university is operational. So from an IRB perspective, the things to consider is that if you're doing any research that's face-to-face with people, you still have to comply with university requirements. So that's the 6 W's. You know, you have to think about social distancing, you must wear a mask. And if there's any exceptions to that, then that has to be confirmed or authorized through your department level or up to the university level if there's some reason that you want to do research that you can't do without social distancing. So, I mean, thinking of a lot of some of our researchers out of kinesiology who actually have exercise studies, there are some of those studies that they are actually able to do because their participants are in totally separate rooms. They're masked up the whole time. Everybody's masked up. You know, they're following those 6 W's in terms of washing your hands, wearing masks, keeping social distancing. But, you know, the flip side of that is that you still have to allow it to be up to your participants, meaning you could recruit for a study that's face-to-face, and if people don't want to do it because they're not comfortable doing face-to-face research, then that's just kind of a sort of a fallout, I guess, of the current situation. So really, I think that some of it is that the IRB is going to defer to what the university requires, and the IRB would also defer to whatever, if you're doing research outside of the university, so at an organization or a company or whatever it may be, that organization standards for kind of restrictions related to COVID would apply. So just as an example, we have a lot of College of Education researchers who are doing research in the school system. And of course, the school systems have been remote learning, in person, like Plan B, like all of these different varieties of how they have students. And our researchers have to comply with that. So if the school district isn't allowing face-to-face instruction, then there's not going to be face-to-face research. So those researchers have really had to pivot to do kind of online stuff. So that's really what the requirement would be, is that you must comply with whatever standards the university requires, the organization requires, or even I mean, the county, the city, if for some reason Mecklenburg County went into full lockdown again, like everybody would stay at home, that absolutely would trump, so to speak, any of the other requirements that the university said. So it's really kind of that sort of tiered approach. Does that kind of get at what you were thinking?
Sure, Kate. That totally makes sense, that we need to see what is the university's regulation. I think before that it was more strict. My research personally had stopped, and I had to resubmit the IRB, and I wanted to know like how is the condition now. So thank you so much.
I would say it's pretty much the same. I mean, until the university does away with their kind of those standards for social distancing and masking, it's going to be this way. So once the university kind of standard changes, then there'll be more flexibility.
I had to record the faces and thermal temperature of the faces, and people had to wear masks. So I'm not doing it now.
Yeah, there's been a lot of researchers. I mean, gosh, for sure, across the nation. I mean, it's been really difficult for researchers. Absolutely.
Thank you so
Well,
much.
yeah, thank you both so much for taking the time to come here and explain this. This has been incredibly informative, I can say, for me, and I think for everyone else as well. And it's 1:30, so with that said, we just wanted to say have a great day, everyone. And yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us. Yeah. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions for us. Right. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank y'all.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you so much, Kate and Uzma, and thank you everyone for joining us. It was a great session. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.